Welcome back, ma'am.
Well, thank you, Atalanto. I'm just sharing my PowerPoint. Is that okay?
Sure, ma'am. Sure, ma'am. Whenever
Yeah,
you are ready, you can start. Thank you.
yes. In fact, I'm ready. We can resume.
Sure, ma'am. Sure, ma'am. Let's start.
Okay. Welcome back, everyone. And this is lecture 8. Lecture 8. Maria Zambrano, the poet, the philosopher, and the enchained in time. Lecture 8 follows up directly from lecture 7. Many of the things we heard apropos of Angela Puccino will return. And in fact, it's a sequential lecture from Puccino's. It's meant to shed further light on some of the moments in Puccino. So before I start, I should specify that I'm totally not in my comfort zone here with Zambrano, because I'm not a scholar of Spanish literature. She was a Spanish, she's a modernist, was a modernist Spanish philosopher, though living most of her life in exile. She left Spain with the rise of Franco's dictatorship, of Franco's fascist regime. She left Spain and lived basically everywhere in the world, especially in Cuba, and transited very briefly through New York and lived also in Italy and then Switzerland, returning to her country only very late in her life when her country had become a democracy. Now, I'm not in my comfort zone, but it is for me a necessity. It became for me a necessity to take on Zambrano because of Puccino. This is a detour that helps me illuminate why I'm interested in Angela Puccino and the potentiality of her thought. Now, in lecture seven, remember we have outlined an open conceptual space, the apparition of an open conceptual space, rife with the potential of a different gaze on ourselves and others. We have come to the point, to that limit of thought with Puccino, where we can envision a human figure disentangled from the exertion of power. We have come to a poor scenario, a scenario of poverty, a nothing but bodies, naked and poor, the scenario of an unsheltered human condition. All symbolic anchoring points fall when reading Puccino. Bodies in an extreme poverty without preserving anything, neither the shelter of identity nor the shelter of opinions. Bodies in a space where the Father is the Son of nothing, an empty space of uncertainty, empty space of uncertainty. This is what she calls that opening that I tried to point to at the end of lecture 7, as an empty space of an uncertainty inhabited by the brother. And your brother is, of course, a loaded word term, a term that has manifold branches, manifold connotations, but it has an audible political valence, brother, in the sense of a human kinship. In lecture 8, I introduced Maria Zambrano because she is one of the thinkers echoed by Angela Puttino. I encountered Zambrano while reading Angela Puttino. And I encountered Angela Puttino by mere chance. So it was not planned. It was a felicitous encounter. One of the thinkers, I turned to Zambrano because, like Puttino, she is one of the thinkers of the unthought, of unforeseen subjects. And I believe this is one of the reasons why Zambrano has been very popular with Italian feminist thinkers in the 1990s. For example, if you heard of Adriana Cavarero, you will see the name on the last slide of lecture 8. If you've heard of Adriana Cavarero worked on Zambrano and built on Zambrano, especially in the mid-90s, from the mid-90s on. But I turned to Zambrano also because, not only because she, of course, Puttino echoes Zambrano's thought, but because Zambrano shares with Puttino a special interest in Antigone, especially in the attempt to try and point to a different political, a different order, a different order of brothers. They both turn to Antigone. Now, here is Maria Zambrano, for what photographs are worth, just so that you can associate a name, an unknown name to an image. You can always research and you can find more about her. But I would say, if I were to isolate the key question in Zambrano, this is it. Was there a time when Logos sheltered everyone's fragile life? The quote is from a fundamental book entitled Philosophy and Poetry, Filosofia e Poesia, 1939. 1939, written in 1939, at the same time as totalitarianism is raging and conquering everybody, seducing many people in Europe. You will remember that Puttino relocates the human figure in a sphere of pietas. We left with that, in a space of possibility, where a different gaze is possible. Puttino's move echoes a similar achievement by her predecessor, Spanish-born philosopher Maria Zambrano, born in 1904, as you've seen in the other slide. Now, who was Zambrano? Intellectually, let's try and contextualize her. She was, first of all, a student of José Ortega y Gasset. She studied with him. She studied with him in Madrid and attended his classes in 1927, so at the end of the 20s. With the rise of the dictatorship of Francisco Franco in 1939, Zambrano leaves the country. Notice that 39 is also the date of publication of an important essay by Ortega, Man the Technician. She leaves the country and becomes a chronic exile, living in France, as I mentioned, Cuba, Italy, in Rome in particular, and then Switzerland. Only after 45 years of exile, she will return to Spain in 1984, more precisely. Her professor, Ortega, let's focus on her intellectual affiliation to Ortega and what it did for her. Her professor, Ortega, had already attempted to think back, so to speak, walk back, thinking not forward but backwards, to a primordial scene of the human condition. Ortega had been concerned about finding another scene, unpacking another scene of the subject, other vis-a-vis, for example, the Cartesian subject, the master of his own discourse. He had done so in the essay Man the Technician, a primordial scene where man is man the technician, that is to say, an unnamed, anonymous human figure, deeply tied to nature, standing on land, he says in the Spanish text, who begins, therefore, who begins in a condition of alienation and restlessness. Why alienation? Because what X does is to produce himself through technical activity by changing the environment, estranging himself from the original surrounding environment by improving and perfecting the environment for his own purposes. So what emerges in Ortega's line of thinking about the human subject, about the human figure, is a creaturely tie. He walks back to analyze, examine a creaturely tie at the origins, a deep and deeply close tie, a connection with land, between human and land, a bond to land, to earth, to nature. In the Spanish, Ortega says tierra, earth, but earth can be understood as land and nature as well. Zambrano, like Ortega, thinks back to the primary scene of a human condition that is quintessentially opaque. The scene of X, Ortega's scene of X, is opaque. Because it's a scene of alienation, it's a scene of estrangement. But Zambrano focuses more closely on the details of the scene that Ortega had painted before her, and she highlights a trait that Ortega had not highlighted, and that is a vulnerability and a gentleness in the human figure that were absent in Ortega. In Zambrano's retracing of the primary scene of the human figure, the scene foregrounds a figure turned with its back to us while looking out to nature. Very visual imagination embedded in Zambrano's philosophical prose. As Zambrano writes in a marvelous little book called Notes of a Method, not notes on, but notes of a method. She is playing on the musical meaning. Man begins not by looking at, not by looking, but by being looked at, and here's the key moment, without knowing by whom nor how. This foregrounds the vulnerability of the human figure. Man begins not by looking, not with a gaze, a governing gaze, potentially harnessed by, biopolitics, but by being looked at. So there is a human figure turning its back to, the gaze. Not knowing who it is being looked by. What does Zambrano mean by this? She wants to suggest the beginning of a different story, different story of the human subject. Zambrano, in fact, like other thinkers of the 20th century, especially like other thinkers of modernity, and like feminist thinkers who will follow her, Angela Putino, wishes to exit. She wishes to, her aim is to exit one traditional thought in particular, which Professor Ortega y Gasset had called the subjectivist perspective. What did he mean by subjectivist? Here does not mean personal. It's something else. It's the perspective of the subject in Western thought, Western philosophy. The subjectivist perspective, that is a way of thinking that, quote, has handled ideas as contents of consciousness. It's the same perspectives that we are trying to exit today with our interest in something beyond other than human. So the human, in imagining a more relational world. That was just a note. As scholars of Zambrano put it, and there are many authoritative scholars. Rodriguez is one, but there are other scholars who are very capable of unpacking the complexities of Zambrano. Some of them are located in Anglophone countries like England. In any case, if you're interested in Zambrano, you're going to find a special issue of the European Journal of the History of Ideas has devoted an entire special issue to Zambrano, and I encourage you, should you develop an interest in her, encourage you to start with a special issue. Again, you will find everything in the works cited slides. So as scholars of Zambrano put it, she wished, quote, to break away from the shackles of the binary logic characteristic of Cartesian reason. End of quote. That was Rodriguez. Now, Zambrano herself writes that man has never been at the origin alone in front of an object. And she goes on to replace the question of the I think, the subject before the object, with the other question of a gaze from the outside. A gaze from the outside, a gaze on the human figure, a different kind of gaze. She criticizes she points the limits of abstract thought. When Rodriguez, in a very fashionable formula, says that she was interested in breaking away from the shackles of Cartesian thought, what that means is that, first and foremost, she was interested in gesturing toward the limits of abstract thought. She criticizes the kind of rationality stemming from, yes, the subject-object divide, as she calls it, the homogeneous clarity and the linear time instituted by consciousness that parade as phantoms of its solitude. Consciousness, human consciousness in its solitude projects phantoms, and those phantoms create the illusion of clarity, illusion of linearity, illusion of logic, illusion of logos, coherent meaning. With the phrase phantoms of solitude, she is pointing to the flaws of abstract thought, the abstract thought stemming from the subject-object divide. Abstraction considers at its best, considers virtue and ideality earned with a gaze, the kind of gaze that has stopped seeing things. In other words, she says, abstract thought, especially the subject-object divide, works with a gaze, an idealized gaze, a kind of gaze that has seeing things, stopped seeing things, that is not drenched in reality, in flesh and blood and body, that stops seeing things. Of course, it reduces things, as someone would say, reduces the subject to an algebraic or kind of an algebraic formula that is valid for everyone. There's a model that can be applied to everyone. She raises the question of an ampler logos, an ampler logos, and she will do that in philosophy of poetry, an ampler logos that is a more charitable, less abstract, more charitable logos. That is her interest in philosophy and poetry, to try and theorize a more charitable logos. Remember the question, was there a time when logos sheltered, so thought, sheltered everyone's fragile life? This is the question from which she takes her cue in philosophy and poetry. A charitable logos, a charitable gaze, not an idealizing gaze. Was there a time when logos sheltered everyone's fragile life? Now, in philosophy and poetry, she is compelled to take on this question by drawing a distinction between the philosopher and the poet. She begins by outlining, in her search for a charitable logos, and how to formulate it, how to begin to present it in words, she begins with a difference between the philosopher and the poet. Let me recap Zambrano's distinction. The philosopher, she argues, creates himself. Creates himself. What does it mean? He thinks, and from thinking, his being is produced. In fact, the subject in philosophy is precisely this, especially the Cartesian I think. I exist insofar as I think. I create myself insofar as I think, in the dimension of thought. There is to this an egoic dimension to Zambrano. By contrast, for Zambrano, the poet represents a way of living according to the flesh. She explains, if the philosopher wants to elude the common temporal measure, so if the philosopher wants to take himself out of the human condition that is essentially mortal and tied to time, if the philosopher wants to take himself away from this condition tied to time by inventing himself through immortalizing himself through thought and writing, we could add, the poet, by contrast, does not seem concentrated, bent on eluding the common temporal measure, but realizes the hope of all those who walk in the procession enchained in time. Those pilgrims. The poet does not want to conquer time, to conquer himself in thought or herself in thought. He's someone, the poet, who needs to return, feels compelled to return among his brothers, his kin, among, as Zambrano puts it, quote, pilgrims whose faces he has seen up close, whose faces he has seen, not scrutinized, whose faces he has seen, taken stock of, up close. So the poet stands for an indispensable attachment to apparent multiplicities, the many pilgrims. Okay, and stands for a logos that can be devoured, shared. It's like a blanket that can be shared, used by everyone. Uh, um, uh, a charitable justice that goes to all those who need it. Now, you can argue that this is a biased, of course, or even an idealized vision of the poet. That was my first impression when I encountered Zambrano. She spoke a language that was very foreign to me. I mean, her theoretical language. But as I kept reading and reading and reading, I mean, she provided the lexicon of an alternative. And clearly, I came to understand that the philosopher and the poet do not so much, or do not only refer to those identities, philosopher and poet, but two forms, two forms of discourse. Now, in the following key passage, I'm going to read a key passage. Zambrano thinks backward. We see Zambrano in action. She thinks backward to a primary scene of the human condition that seems to pave the way for Puttino's poverty. And that's the reason why I read Zambrano here, because it seems to me that she's paving the way to Puttino's poverty. Here is the passage. All of us one day hope to be caught. Clearly, this occurs in a larger architecture where she's trying to describe the human condition. So remember, it's just we're zooming in on only one passage. All of us one day hope to be called by our name, that name that no one else knows, neither ourselves nor the eternal mother. All of us at times hope to be called by this Father, whose hand and whose face we have felt on our head in the shape of a prohibition in our early days, a shadow on our innocent forehead in the uncanny garden of our childhood. We believed we had heard a faraway echo of that voice at our back during our adolescence when we wanted to run from home, crossing the limits of the protected garden. His gaze, piercing the clouds as reached, softened our cheeks, burning them with the fire of fear and desire. We have felt it like an infinite halo on the forehead and beyond the figure of our earthly Father. What happens here is, first of all, an alchemical process whereby Zambrano pulverizes Oedipus, psychoanalytically understood, turns away from the meaning of father in terms of biological father, although she evokes the rebellion that we may experience in our childhood, in our adolescence against a figure, pulverizes all that, steers away from that, and lands on a suggestive, though dispersed, different meaning of father. It's suggestive, dispersed, it's far away echo, infinite halo. It comes from a very distant space, time, and it carries with it a noun, a name that we have not heard before, that in fact it is our name, the name that we had wanted and had not heard before. There's an effort here at theorizing differently. Of course, the language is, it's very suggestive. It's not abstract theoretical argumentation. And the passage occurs at the same time that Zambrano depicts the human condition as a procession of the enchained in time, the procession from which the philosopher wants to withdraw, take himself away from. Well, the poet, stays with it. He has seen the faces of the brothers in the metaphorical sense of the others in the procession. He has seen those faces and is looking for an alternative. So take philosopher and poet as names of two subjectivities, two discourses yet to be thought out, named. But this passage depicts an unsheltered condition, again, an anonymous. It occurs at the same time as Zambrano has outlined an anonymous procession in which each and every figure awaits to hear its proper name. Instead of the subject-object divide, instead of consciousness, we get sound. We are literary people. We pay attention, even when we are not. We are people interested in language. We pay attention to the way Zambrano is using words here, even though this is a text in translation. We get sound, but sound lost in the distance, carried by a voice in the distance. The dimensional voice takes over, in fact. Faraway echo, hope to be called, faraway echo, called by our own name, hope to be called, faraway echo, we had heard. A dimensional voice takes over, phone prevails over logos. Zambrano redirects the father as a principle, an idea, from the conceptual principle that in fact it is, in psychoanalysis, redirects that, takes our attention away from the father as principle. And you will recall we mentioned this also in lecture 7 in psychoanalytic accounts of subjectivity. The father is the conceptual principle, Oedipus, which presides over the symbolic order, our entrance in language and in sociality and in meaning. Without the Oedipal threshold, we cannot function properly. That's the psychoanalytic account. So Zambrano redirects the father from conceptual principle to voice, disperses. It's a way of eroding the father as conceptual principle, disperses it into voice. But the voice of the father in Zambrano's scene of the enchained in time is not there to ensure an entrance in the symbolic order. It is the trace of a charitable gaze, softened our cheeks, a charitable gaze that reflects her search for a charitable logos. It's concrete image, concrete up to a certain point, because it's an echo. It's the trace of a sound. So Zambrano, I share this passage because I would like to propose that Zambrano paves the way for Puccino's own possession of bodies. Remember, we quoted her, naked, equal. Let me see if I put it. We have read the quote from Puccino in the previous lecture. Remember, naked, Puccino's procession, naked, equal, despoiled, as only the desert and poverty can render the human. She's talking about bodies, the procession, the unsheltered condition in terms of a procession of bodies, imagined as a procession of bodies, captured, grasped as a procession of bodies. After the analysis of biopolitics, which presumes a human subject always liable to be addressed as an object of care, at the crossroads of the shelter of identity and norms, you remember the precipice of formlessness, Putino finds the vulnerability of Zambrano's human figure. She bumps into the vulnerability of Zambrano's human figure and of Zambrano's own Enchained in Time, which echo in Putino's Desert and Processional Bodies. So if we can say that there is this way whereby Putino builds on Zambrano, takes Zambrano in her discourse in the attempt to exit biopolitics, it is also true that Putino is taken by Zambrano's scenarios, or Zambrano's primary scene of human condition, because it bears connection with the figures of Antigone. There is a cluster of thinkers that I refer to as the thinkers of Antigone, not only Putino, Zambrano, but also in the Anglophone world, for example, Bonnie Honig, a political philosopher, devoted a book to Antigone, but also Butler. Antigone has been important in Butler's own evolution, and she has drawn on Antigone to theorize a different kind of kinship, to take on the question of what holds us together beyond the social tie, which is a tie that pins us to identities, just as Putino said. So there is a cluster of thinkers that I refer to, the thinkers of Antigone, and I'm intrigued by the uses that they make of Antigone. But here I will focus, of course, on the Zambrano-Putino connection. Now, but why Antigone? We can, even despite the shortage of time, we can begin to hint at the reasons why Antigone may be central, maybe a kind of conceptual or semantic switch here for these thinkers. Well, Antigone the myth, first of all, she's a myth, both a myth and a figure, and of course she's a character as well in Sophocles' play, written in 5th century Greece, 5th century Greece, a time before the Christian era. So it's a classical play that has never stopped to cast its spell on thinkers. Both the myth combined with Sophocles' rendition. If you list the most prominent thinkers of the West, from, I don't know, Hegel to Derrida, including some poet thinkers like Hölderlin, Goethe too, they have all something to say about Antigone. Hegel, for example, in Hegel, Antigone becomes the principle of cyclicity, there is ethicity, the ethical principle. But just to name a few, there is a list of thinkers who have not stopped using and drawing on Antigone. But why do feminist thinkers draw on Antigone? They have a particular reason. Antigone stands the figure of Antigone stands for someone who seizes speech from the margins, first and foremost. She rebels to the tyrant Creon and to his values. We mentioned that briefly yesterday in the tutorial. Antigone is a figure that insists on bearing the corpse of her brother. The entire play by Sophocles revolves around a body, a dead body, a cadaver. The main action, is Antigone's burial or attempt to honor her brother Polynices with burial rites and defying the law, because Polynices had betrayed, had fought against Creon for the seizure of power. So Creon had condemned him not to receive proper burial rites. And if you don't receive proper burial rites, you are not considered as human. Antigone insists on burying the corpse of her brother to honor him, declaring the value of his life, emphasizing the value of his life. For Creon, moreover, Antigone defies Creon because she disagrees, although she's a woman. And in the Greek polis, she did not belong. She belonged to the oikos, the domestic sphere, so she cannot speak and she cannot participate in the sphere of appearance. Despite that, Antigone from the margins defies Creon with a different vision of the political. Her political vision revolves around what she calls unwritten laws without being able to justify them or to describe them. But she defies Creon's vision because it reduces all lives to the law, to the readability of by the law, readability made possible by law, by the law. Zambrano rewrites Sophocles' play, and in her own rewrite, La Tumba di Antigona, the tomb of Antigone, Antigone does not die, does not kill herself. In Sophocles' play, Antigone commits suicide. She dies in her tomb. She's cornered into a tomb and she dies. In Zambrano's play, Antigone does not die. She could not die because Zambrano argues she had no right to live, to speak in the polis. So how can she die? So Zambrano rewrites and corrects Sophocles, prolonging Antigone's life. And what does Antigone stand for? Well, Zambrano is interested in life that exceeds the singular living being. Antigone stands for life that exceeds the singular living being. She defends the value of the singular living being, her brother, but Antigone stands for life that exceeds the singular living being. There is the insistence on bearing the corpse of her brother in Zambrano is a way of honoring the brother, but it is also a way of declaring the value of his life, and that's why it exceeds and the lives of all brothers. The brother Polynices, the dead Polynices, in Zambrano's reading is highly representative of all brothers, of the lives of all brothers, the lives that remain unvalued, unburied, that is non-human, hovering in that sphere that is unqualified life outside of the polis. So Zambrano's Antigone thus flows from her vision of the human condition as a chain of anonymous beings marching with others, bound to time. That's the connection I want you to make. There is an interest in Antigone because Antigone resonates, the potential of this figure resonates with the different vision of the subject that Zambrano has, and the different and with her view of the human condition as a chain of the unsheltered human condition, a chain of anonymous beings marching with others bound to time. Now, Putino turns to Antigone as someone who moves away, who errs. ERRS would be the English word for errare, erranza. To err means to roam, to wander around, to deviate from something. And so that Antigone is someone who moves away, errs from the set path, so that she can be near the father. But what kind of father? Putino, I think, as Bartro will do in her book on kingship and Antigone, has in mind Oedipus at Colonus, the play that forms, and it's the twin play of Antigone, and we have a very weak Oedipus, and Antigone assisting her wandering, derelict, dirty and poor father. Remember that Oedipus was also Antigone's brother, because Oedipus had, unbeknownst to him, married his mother Jocasta. So Polynices, Antigone are not, and Eteocles, the other brother, are not just daughter and sons of Oedipus. They are also at the same time brothers, united in the kinship of brotherhood. So in Oedipus at Colonus, Antigone assists her wandering, derelict, dirty, and poor father, who is also her brother, possessing nothing, and having become the target of criticism and exile. And this is the father, Putino, and also Butler, I insist, will argue, this is the father that Antigone loves. This derelict, dirty, poor, failing father. Oedipus. Proceed with order and recap Putino. So Antigone is someone who, as you see in the first quote on the slide, as Putino says, can love Oedipus without Oedipus. That is, Oedipus without the theory of Oedipus, whether it be psychoanalytic or other, without the father as a principle. Thus, as the symbol of an order of brothers, Oedipus without Oedipus, projects a lateral order of brothers. She makes direct reference to the other play in Sophocles. In Sophocles' trilogy, that is Oedipus at Colonus, where, and I quote Putino, it is as wandering, derelict, dirty, poor, possessing nothing, the target of criticism, that Antigone loves Oedipus. There, in Oedipus at Colonus, Antigone loves an Oedipus who possesses nothing. This is a quote from Putino, whose voice is nothing but the fold of an utterance of which he was not the utterer, but the weak vessel. The weak vessel. Antigone loves her father without the father. Quote, the desire that supports Antigone, says Putino, is love of the father. Love of the father in erring, in deviating, in moving away from the father. End of quote. So Putino locates Antigone's desire where the Oedipal does not exist, where the father, she says, is the brother. Is the brother. Again, in an, quote, in an empty space where the father is the brother, in an empty space, an uncertainty inhabited by the brother. So Putino's Antigone could be anyone in Zambrano's procession of anonymous bodies. Finally, Antigone seems to be a foundational figure because she insists on a brother against all reason and without offering an acceptable explanation as why she insists on bearing that particular brother. In fact, at a certain point in Sophocles' play, she says, if it had been a mother, I would not have defied Creon's prohibition. If it had been my father, she seems almost cruel. She insists on that particular brother, on the brother who was denied by law, burial, and that is the right to be human, to have lived a life as a human. It's a wonderful scene in Sophocles when the guard that Creon has asked to um, as asked to discover who the culprit who had defied his law, and they all think it's a man. The guard, spots Antigone trying to cover the body of her brother with dust, and Antigone is compared. She appears as a bird. Piercing the air, which shrieks with the incomprehensible sounds. It's a marvelous moment when the human verges on the creaturely or human animal. And so you're made to see the continuum, the biological continuum of flesh from which Antigone is trying to take the brother away, to mark his life as a life in a human continuum. However, the continuum is both human and animal. It would be too complex to launch into a discussion of this. The best reader of this scene in Sophocles is Adriana Cavarero. You'll find her in the PowerPoint. So Zambrano and Putino's Antigone. Now, Antigone seems to be a foundational figure because she insists on a brother against all reason and without offering an acceptable explanation. That brother becomes the symbol of all the unvalued brothers. So the question of the brother stands for the question of unvalued lives. Antigone for Zambrano points, quote, beyond and against the arrogance of the pure and self-founding reason of BI, as Cavarero clarifies. And Andrea Putino's Antigone, of course, built on Zambrano's Antigone. We have seen I will, of course, stop here because we are out of time. But let me conclude by recapping what we have achieved. We have seen, we have witnessed a critical practice that expands. The notion of critical practice with Putino, with Zambrano, expands further to include the interrogation of the human subject, with an emphasis on literature and art as an aesthetic political continuum. And this is true, of course, this is a recap not only of Putino and Zambrano as the climax of our lectures, but also a recap of the purpose and aim of our lectures. Thank you very much. This is the works-cited slide as usual. I stopped sharing the screen to thank you for your attention and your patience. And I very much look forward to our tutorial. I will take, thank you, Srijita, I will take your notes, questions, comments, and we'll have our usual conversation during the tutorial. Thank you. Atolanto.
Yeah, thank you so much, ma'am. Thank you so much once again. So we will finish the meeting at this point, and we will again reunite after maybe half 1.5 hour, right after post lunch.
Yes,
It
thank
will,
you.
yeah,
Let me double check with you, just to be on the
2:30, I
safe
think.
side. 13:30 my time,
Right,
Venice
right,
time, right?
right,
Okay.
right, ma'am. Right,
Thank you
ma'am.
so much.